Welcome back to part 2 of the Fox shock rebuild. Let's get started. Okay, first off, we're going to start by reassembling the shock shaft with the seal head and all the valving and all the components necessary. So I already installed the 2 seals within the seal head. I'll show you what those look like though here. This is what I installed. One's an O-ring and one's like a quad ring. So first thing is we need to install this O-ring into the bottom of the eyelet cap. Next, we're going to be installing a new bottom out bumper. The old one in part 1, I was showing that it was deteriorated, coming apart, so we're going to put a new one on.
And did you find a lot of the debris?
Did find out the debris. It a little bit was stuck into the shock shims and did make its way into this compression adjuster. So we thoroughly cleaned everything, and you know, now we're going to assemble. Put our shaft bullet on there so it doesn't wreck the seals and O-ring. Apply a little grease. I do need to add this O-ring. This seals the seal head to the body. We're going to install the samurai seal. This opening faces up.
Explain why it's called that. Is that the manufacturer or the type of the seal?
Yeah, Fox calls it that. They actually, this is like a samurai wiper, and then these they actually refer to the same samurai seals. Now, this seal here, when we get to the air sleeve, on the ATV shocks they install a black one. In the snowmobile shock they install a blue one. But I use the blue because the material is a little stiffer, and I feel that it keeps the debris from getting inside the seal head. Install the seal head. Next is the negative spring. Shortening spacer, valve stack.
And that little post you use to keep it together, you said some people use a zip tie, but you prefer that post?
Yeah, I mean, this is just something that I've seen some other people do, and I just kind of elaborated a little bit on it. It's very simple, but it just keeps everything together instead of a flexible zip tie. Because with the zip tie, then you got to cut it, and it's kind of awkward putting it back on, where this just makes it easy.
Very convenient to just turn it upside down and have them slide into position.
Yeah. We're going to torque this nut to 17 foot-pounds. Now, I didn't replace this wiper on the primary valve because there was no issues with it. This, because it doesn't have a split, some of the other designs are split like this would be. This is a one piece. In order to replace this, you'd have to cut this, and there's an actual tapered sizing tool that this new bushing would slide onto, so it would grow so you could fit it over top of that primary valve.
Now, what's the material made out of on those wipers?
You know,
it's not like a foam or rubber, is it?
No, it's fiber.
Okay.
So we're going to put that off to the side temporarily. We're going to come to the air sleeve. There's an O-ring at the bottom of this, real thin one. That keeps debris when it's eventually sealed inside of that. Next, we're going to install the next two Samurai seals. One's a wiper, this inner black one. This one's the scraper.
The difference between them?
The scraper is stiffer, which tries to keep the debris out, and then the wiper is a secondary to keep the stuff out. And then you have the bushing inside of there that keeps it straight while it's traveling. Now in here I like to put quite a bit of grease inside of this because it migrates its way around inside there when the shock is traveling, and you need to keep things lubricated in there, or eventually what happens is that becomes dry and wipes out this Samurai seal here. Now that we have grease installed there, this is another bullet tool to prevent damage to those seals. Next, I'm going to install the high-low speed compression adjuster. Install these two O-rings.
Can you show us the inside of that socket, what it looks like?
It's three-sided.
Got it.
Next, install the O-ring on the internal floating piston. This goes into the reservoir, separates the gas and oil. This is another wiper band.
Do that one more time for us.
Fill the shock with oil in the reservoir up to the top. Install the IFP so a little bit of oil comes out. That way you're not trapping any air inside of there. I'm just helping the band fit down inside of there. Now, one thing that's tricky here is a lot of these float shocks, this air sleeve is shorter and exposes the seal head more than this does. So what ends up happening is if you fill this too much with oil, and as you're bleeding the shock, the oil will get in between the air sleeve and the body. It's not a big deal, but what will happen is when you get everything assembled, you're going to find that oil is going to come out and it'll weep out over a short amount of time, but it will come out of this Samurai seal. So what I'm going to do here is keep the oil fairly low, maybe a couple of inches. I'm going to bleed the shock, and then I'm going to keep it low, a little bit low, so that I don't force the oil into that air sleeve. Or try not to anyway.
To the end, crib outside the city, I don't feel safe in my hands. Took so many years, I was waiting for the wins. I'm in debt to no one but the one who took my sins. I do it for real, there's no reason to pretend. If I do it once, I do it again. Add it up, bankroll, euro, peso, add it up. I'm just doing me, everything is on me, oh you matter what. Add it up, bankroll, euro, peso, add it up. I'm just doing me, everything is on me, oh you matter what. I'm told if it's all me, everything
Tapping
is
on
me, gon' back it up.
the shock shaft flutters the valves and helps release any trapped air. Right now it is moving stiff in both directions, and that's just due to how the valving is set up.
I feel like while you're working this this out would be a good time to encourage our viewers to subscribe and like.
Absolutely. I appreciate everybody watching, and we're going to do all kinds of different videos, and hopefully people have some really good suggestions and we can accommodate. The oil is about 1/4 inch below the edge of this inner body. So I'm leaving it like that so that when I tighten the seal head, I don't push oil over the top and down into the air sleeve. But it's just high enough where I'm not going to trap a ton of air. There is going to be a little bit, but I'm going to show you how we're going to be removing that coming up next here.
Why you hating on me? It's not adding up. Told her if it's all me, everything is on me. Gon' back it up. Matter what? Told you I'ma do me. Why you hating on me? It's not adding up.
All right, we're going to be torquing this seal head to 35 foot-pounds.
Using your specialty tool?
Yeah, torque wrench.
No, the head.
Yes. Pin spanner.
And you said that's made by Fox?
Yes. You can get these specialty tools. There's 2 distributors that I know of and that I use, one of which is High Gear Suspension in Ithaca, New York. The other is Carver Performance, and they're out of Minnesota. Okay, next, I'm going to install the wipers. I try to stagger the seam or the gap 180 from one another. They will probably move around and, you know, not end up there in the future, but it's just something that I like to do.
What's the difference between a wiper and a seal in terms of keeping dirt out?
Well, a scraper is designed more to just clean either the shaft here or this air sleeve on the body. And a seal is to seal either air or oil in this case. Inside of here, and it's going to be hard to see, but inside of one of these recessed holes, there's a small Allen set screw. Okay, we're going to install the charge cap. I installed a new Schrader valve and fitting, which came in the kit. Which let me show you that too. This is all what goes into these shocks. There's a lot of seals, O-rings, scrapers, charge fittings, air fittings. So it's very complex, but it can be done if you already have, you know, some shock knowledge. It's not too bad to navigate through, but it is more involved than a regular shock. Now that we have that in, snap rings in, fittings in, we're going to charge the shock to 200 psi of nitrogen. Now, I'd like to verify, because I don't always trust the regulator on the nitrogen tank. So this shows 250. I'm going to back it down to 200.
Is that a rider preference setting?
No, this is what the shock calls for. The nitrogen value remains the same at 200. The air settings in the chambers is a ride height and or ride preference. So now that that's charged, that's applying force against the oil against that floating piston, and now we're going to crack this loose and it's going to push air out. Then I like cycling the shock a few times. Just anything trapped in the valves. I don't hear anything. It's nice and smooth. And I'm just gonna bleed it again. See if we get any more air out of it.
Now why do we see oil on the shaft?
That's just because it's pooled up on top of the seal head.
Okay.
I'm gonna wipe that out here.
Came up when releasing the air.
When I was releasing the air. And actually, I'm just gonna leave the little bit of oil in there because next what I'm gonna do, about a tablespoon of this FOXS fluid. So this is recommended. A lot of times in the kits, they give you this little pillow pack, they call it, that has about a tablespoon of this oil in it. So I'm just gonna use my judgment, put about a tablespoon or so. Now, the reason for that is now that this is assembled, or when it will be assembled, as the shock is moving up and down, it's keeping the inside of the air sleeve lubricated. So again, that seal, that samurai seal on the seal head doesn't dry out and start deteriorating and leaving like rubber trail on the inside of this, which is causing stiction. So right now this is all to prevent that.
Stiction?
Stiction.
As in when things get sticky?
Yes, I didn't come up with that word. That's world renowned apparently. Okay. That's another thing too, because that oil and FOXS fluid is inside of there, people always ask me, you know, I hook my air valve or the pump to it, and then when I release it, I see some blue fluid out of it. It's all normal. You know, that's nothing to worry about there. And if I would have gotten oil in the air sleeve, when this would have traveled up and down, it would have pushed out here. We shouldn't have that problem in this case because I was able to avoid that. I'm going to clean the air sleeve up. A little bit of brake cleaner, rubbing alcohol, acetone, any of that stuff works well. You want to get this clean so you can use the strap wrench to tighten this all up.
Do you have to do that by a torque setting, or you do it by feel?
You have to do it by feel. I'm not sure if there's a torque setting because I don't know how you would. I've never.
Yeah, with a
strap wrench.
Strap wrench. Yeah.
I've never seen a strap wrench with like a device to torque it. There could very well be, but I've never seen it. So, and any literature that I've ever seen too, they don't ever specify anything about that.
So you're going by when it's snug?
Yeah, you can feel it bottom out. It gets tight, and you'll definitely know when it's tight. It almost kind of makes a little bit of a noise in the bottom threaded area. I need to clean this off a little bit better.
While you're cleaning it off, talk to us a little bit about this particular shock and the generations that's come before it.
Okay, so this is a FOXS Float 3 or RC2. They have a couple different names for it. The previous generations were a Gen 2 and then a Gen 1. A lot of that had to do with a Generation 1, this area here where the EVOL chamber attaches. This was actually two pieces on a Gen 1. Then in Gen 2 and now in 3, this is a molded assembly. But on a 3, this is centered, this EVOL is centered in the body cap, where on a 1 and a 2 they were offset, so it was a left and a right essentially, where this you could use on either side. The other thing too is this Kashima hard coat anodize is supposed to be a little bit slipperier than the black anodize they use in the previous versions, and again helping with stiction, letting the shock work better. It can react faster, and they use that coating in the reservoir. They also use it in the air sleeve, and they use it on the floating piston.
Gotcha.
One thing too is that the Generation 1, And the Generation 2 parts, a lot of the parts are becoming obsolete. You can still get air sleeves, but if you damage the body cap, unless you know of somebody with good used parts, it's going to be hard to come by. So air sleeves are available, some reservoirs are available, some odds and ends, but body eyelets, the Gen 1 and 2 EVOL eyelet, no longer available.
Now you said they switched it from being a right and a left to it being universal either side. Did they do that so if you broke one shock in a collision or accident, you could replace either side with whatever you had?
I suppose that's possible. I think it was more on a manufacturing end that, you know, they could just build a bunch of these instead of having to worry about left and right. They probably figured out that having it in the center is not going to affect anything, getting into A-arms, hitting anything like that while it's traveling, both for the snowmobile and the ATV. So that's what I'm assuming that they did. I'm sure it's streamlined the manufacturing. Next, we're going to install this floating piston that goes inside of the EVOL chamber.
Very good.
Add a little grease to this.
And using the same type of grease throughout the entire rebuild.
Yes. It's a KYB grease. It's very light. Works very well. It's not too expensive. So I just put that in a little bit. Actually, what I'm going to do.
Show us, hold to the camera. There you go, just like that.
So for just this intensive purpose, I'm going to push this piston up because when I assemble this and I add air to this, you're going to hear it snap down, which means it's traveling. And that's something that you want to keep in mind. That floating piston needs to be down and you need to have maximum air volume. That is why it's important that you let the air out of here and out of the main chamber and you put your EVOL chamber first and then you set your main chamber. Otherwise, that floating piston is going to be in a different position and it's not going to work. Also, same thing goes for the shock needs to be extended. So if it's in the vehicle, it needs to be off of the ground. This sticker is also going to be replaced.
Yeah, I noticed it was half peeled off.
Yeah. So at this moment, I'm just going to rip this off. Okay, so I am going to add air, about 150 pounds, into this EVOL chamber, but I'm not going to put it into the main chamber yet because I do want to run on the dyno, and we're going to show you how that works. I want to make sure that I don't hear anything funny, and I want to look at the graph to make sure that I don't have any air, which will show cavitation, and we'll see what the data shows. We're going to install a brand new Schrader fitting and new O-ring. Takes a 10mm socket. Tighten up. I'm going to fill the EVOL chamber to 150 pounds. I charged the EVOL chamber to 150 psi, but I'm leaving the main chamber empty because we're going to put it in the shock dyno, we're going to cycle the shock, and I want to see what the data shows. But I don't want to add air to it because that will manipulate the numbers and throw the numbers off. And I don't want to do any of that. I want to make sure the shock is moving you know, on its own. Ideally, I probably should have done it before I installed the air sleeve, but either which way, I'm not worried about it for a performance aspect or what the valving is doing. I'm doing it more for durability, and I want to see what it's doing so there's no issues. And then once that's done, we'll fill the main chamber up. I like to, just as a generic, put 50 pounds in the main, 150 in the EVOL. When I send it back to the customer, they're going to put their settings in it that they've been using. So next thing here is we're going to take it to the dyno.
I ran up a check, I might do it again. Enemies close, had me thinking they're friends. 10 toes down, I'll be free until the end. Crib outside the city, I don't feel safe in my hands. Took so many years, I'm just waiting for the wins. I'm in debt to no one but the one who took my sins. I do it for real, there's no reason to pretend. If I do it once, I do it again. Add it up, bankroll, euro, peso, add it up. I'm just doing me, everything is on me. Oh, you matter what? Add it up, bankroll, euro, peso, add it up. I'm just doing me, everything is on me. Oh, you matter what? Add it up. Told her if it's all me, everything is on me. Gon' back it up. Matter what? Told ya I'ma do me. Why you hating on me? It's not adding up. I do roll like a Mack truck. Country heart, I might cop a farm and go act up. Lot of scars, I was cold-hearted, now I'm back up.
We have the shock in the dyno. Settings are in the middle. There's no air in the main chamber. The EVOL chamber has air in it, but it's not going to affect this test. Basically, we're just looking to see if the shock is performing how it should. I have some other baselines in the computer that I can, you know, go against to make sure it's fine. So we're going to run it through a test right now. I'm not really looking for any specific number. I just want to look at the graph lines to make sure that the shock is performing correctly. The lines should be fairly tight together, no squigglies, nothing goofy indicating that there's air trapped in or a problem with the shim on the primary piston. Let's see what it shows here. This 0 to 212 is the compression portion. This below is the rebound portion. I'm not really worried about numbers. What I'm really looking at here is that these lines are tight together and there's no squigglies, nothing goofy, indicating the shock is working correctly. So we're good there. I'm going to bring up an example of a shock that's not so good. So here you can see that the lines are not tight together. A few different things can happen here. Either you leave a fitting in on the main chamber and it increases, it's adding air pressure to it, which is increasing both of your forces, or there could be air in the system. Generally with that though, you get some squigglies. So this is just an example of something that you're looking between the two, trying to find good and bad. Okay, now we're on to removing it out of the dyno. We're going to put 50 pounds of air in the main chamber, and then we're going to place the caps on all the charge ports and wash the shock and get it prepared to go back to the customer. Once we have the shock all cleaned up too, I need to replace the EVOL chamber sticker, replace our shop sticker, and also put a service interval sticker on it so that the customer knows when the next time it should be serviced. So this shock is complete. Now we're going to move on to the rear shock. Okay, we're on to reassembling the rear shock. I did install all the seals into the seal head, O-ring on the IFP, and an O-ring on new charge cap before we started this, just to make this a little bit quicker process. So I'm going to put a little bit of grease inside the seal head. Install bottom out bumper, dust cap, now we're going to install primary valve, thing to touch on here, this has a bleed shim. This bleed shim might be hard to see, but has an extension off it with a slot. That needs to line up with the port in the piston. It won't work right if it's not. So that's currently lined up dead center. Now we're going to install, this is the lock nut and the bottoming out device in one. And this will be torqued 25 foot-pounds. Okay, this is that bottoming device I was explaining. This, the other side of this, which is down inside of the body, this is what this goes into at the bottom of the travel. So this slows the shock down the last probably 1.5 inches of the shock travel. So you're using hydraulic bottoming device instead of just relying completely on this foam bottom out bumper.
Now do you insert that piece into the body first?
This is still into, I've never removed it out of this. This is just one that I had that I wanted to use for explanation.
Understood.
We're going to fill the reservoir up with oil. Install the IFP.
IFP stands for what?
Internal floating piston. I'm going to set this at 4 inches. It's actually a little over 4 inches because when we set the seal head, that's going to move. Bring the oil up to about 3/4 of an inch from the top so we just don't have a ton of spillover. One thing that can make life a little easier too, tighten up the low speed compression adjuster. This will help not let as much fluid go into the reservoir, and it'll keep this from moving, the floating piston from moving. Make life a little easier here. Same thing, hold the shock shaft. You can see that the bubbles are coming up out of it. it can be a difficult process sometimes. It all depends. This shock, the valving is really stiff, and that enhances the air being trapped inside of the shims. So by keep moving this kind of up and down and smacking the shock shaft like that helps get that air out of there.
You said these shocks were set up for motocross?
They are. The top of this back plate on the shock shaft, there's the bleed hole for the rebound circuit. You want to make sure that's covered in oil so you don't suck air back in, which we are good. Now we're going to set the seal head. I opened up the compression adjuster now. That'll help the seal head to push. It'll let fluid transfer into there. Install the snap ring. I leave that off until the very end to make sure we don't have to take it back apart, and I want to make sure that no oil is leaking out of that seal.
Thank you.
We're going to install the charge cap. Push the shock shaft down. And we're going to charge to 200 psi. Use our Fox gauge to verify. Spray with soapy water, check for any leaks. Appears to be good. You'll pretty much know right away if you have a leak. It foams up quickly. Wipe this out, verify. Looks good. Tap down this press cap.
I ran up a check, I might do it again. Enemies close, had me thinking they're friends. 10 toes down, I'll be free until the end. Crib outside the city.
That completes the reassembly of this rear shock. We're just going to set this back in the middle settings, low speed. The high speed was already set the middle settings. This concludes our video on the Fox shock for the YFZR 450. Please like and subscribe. We'll see you on the next one.
Add it up, bankroll, euro, peso, add it up. I'm just doing me, everything is on me. Oh, you matter what? Add it up. Told her if it's all me, everything is on me. Gon' back it up. Matter what? Told you I'ma do me. Why you hating on me? It's not adding up.